Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about how we can support the development of cybersecurity standards with the activity of developing security assurance cases. So the main idea here is how do we use our security engineering activities to inform how to develop cybersecurity standards, which then feed back into how do we conduct our security engineering activities. So where we're going to start this discussion today is a look at some motivation. And we can draw our motivation from the recently released national cybersecurity strategies, both by the Government of Canada and by the United States federal government. And both of these documents make numerous references to the need for standardization in cybersecurity. So for example, when we start looking at the Canadian National Cybersecurity Strategy, it makes explicit mention that organizations have asked for such cybersecurity standards and are asking for government assistance in actually clarifying the requirements and expectations so that they can improve their cybersecurity. There's a mention that Canada can actually provide leadership in creating and adopting best practices and cybersecurity standards, and a call for modernization of the legislation and regulations associated with standards development. So this is what Canada has to say about it. When we start looking at what the United States says about it, we see much of the same sort of thing, in that the United States federal government can be a leader in developing and implementing standards, especially in emerging areas, and that it's the role of the federal government to actually support and promote open industry-led standards activities based on sound technological principles. So what we start seeing in the United States security strategy is a bit more precision on what these standards might look like. So when we get down to it, my main motivation here is when we look at the last point that we have from the United States National Cybersecurity Strategy is that standards and practices should be outcome-oriented based on sound technological principles. So this is where I want to draw from, is how do we start developing standards to be this way? So when we start looking at the landscape of cybersecurity standards, we have many to choose from. So there are many organizations, both at the government level and industry-led organizations as well, that provide some sort of standardization document, best practices, or guidelines for cybersecurity. And as we start digging through each of the documents that these organizations provide, we can find that there's a bit of a spectrum here. And one of the main challenges for practitioners in this space is I have all of these different standards, which one do I choose? Or which combination of these do I choose? How do I choose, right? All of these questions start arising. So when we see a graphic like this, weaker coverage doesn't necessarily mean that this standard is bad. What it means is that there's less content in those standardization documents that provide the guidance to cover all of the different kinds of cybersecurity issues that different organizations might face. So what we need to start doing is think about what's the benefit of standardization, right? So we can think about standards as something that can bring some value, but with the caveat that standards aren't going to be our silver bullet as well. So when we think about the value added by standards for cybersecurity, what does a standard provide, right? It gives us that quote, tried and true policies, procedures, overall guidance for cybersecurity, right? Typically, standards are developed by a wide professional conglomerate that's providing input to the development of these standards, and they're bringing in past experiences for ways in which they solved commonly occurring problems. And really where I myself see the benefit of having standardization is that it facilitates certification efforts. So when we start thinking about different kinds of systems, and especially systems that operate in critical high trust environments, we need to start thinking about how can we provide proper assurance that these systems are going to operate as intended at all times. And often what we found is that this was only really possible for systems that were able to justify the high costs associated with doing all of the analysis and providing that kind of assurance in order to support the full compliance with these high assurance standards documents. So when we think about challenges, though, as we saw with the landscape on the previous slide, there really is no overarching set of cybersecurity standards being consistently followed, and this is across all domains. So within particular domains, there are standards of choice, of course, but when we start thinking about this wide range of available options, most organizations are having trouble determining what am I supposed to do with all of this. And one of the reasons for this is that some of the standards documents lack focus and they lack specificity, which makes the compliance either way too difficult or in some cases much too easy. So some standards documents fall into the problem of becoming just these big, long checklists that organizations simply go and they start checking off all the boxes, and as soon as they have a check mark in each of the boxes, they comply and everything's fine. But that's not always enough, right? So if I have a checkbox that says, do you have a lock on the front door of your house? That's all well and good if you can check that box, but often we miss that follow-up question that says, do you properly operate the lock on your door to ensure that your door is in fact locked so that others can't enter your house? And often we find that there isn't really that precision in these kinds of standards documents. Two, when we start thinking about different domains and different jurisdictions, while we do have some international standards, it's not always the case that these are the standards of choice. And then we run into issues of having standards documents that are applicable in the United States and in Europe, and these actually have different requirements in them. And then finally, one of the biggest challenges when we start thinking about standardization is, what do we do with our legacy systems when we have to start bringing legacy systems up to compliance? So whenever we have a change in the standards, that means we have to go back and we have to reevaluate and recertify those systems. And this can often trigger a very long certification process that many organizations don't want to enter into. So what we have to start thinking about is when we want to improve the cybersecurity of a system, what a standards document should help us to define is how secure is secure enough, because there's a very rich context that has to be considered when we are securing a system. So if, for example, you think about securing a pacemaker, that has a much different context than a nuclear power plant, than an airplane, for example, and often our consumer electronics, like our smart speakers and all of our smart devices within our houses, fall under the radar of a lot of these compliance requirements. And one would argue that when we start thinking about these systems, it's easy to think that a pacemaker or a nuclear power plant will have some cybersecurity standards and best practices, and that they will actually have requirements to comply with those. But when we think about the criticality of the appliances in our house, for example, they're often not thought of as these critical services in much the same way that a pacemaker or a power plant would be. So the current approaches that we have don't really give us that guidance in saying, what does secure enough actually mean for the system that I provide? And what we find is that these approaches aren't actually standardized. The way in which you choose how secure is secure enough for the product that you develop is not written out in a standards document explicitly for you to follow. When it is given as a guideline, it's often far too subjective. It's the feeling of the manufacturer of these devices or of these systems that this is secure enough, and what that decision ends up coming down to is, I've spent enough money on this, it's good enough, I don't want to spend any more. And then finally, when we start in employing this sort of subjective view onto what secure enough means, we often make many assumptions about the way the system operates and the way in which adversaries would try to attack these systems. And it is sometimes the case that these assumptions are false, which means that everything we do as a result of this starts crumbling down. So what I'm proposing is to think about how do we develop cybersecurity standards in the context of security assurance. So when I say security assurance, I'm really referring to those processes that are in place that give us the confidence that the systems we develop are designed in such a way that they have that level of security, that they're secure enough for the context that they are going to be operating in and for the associated risks and potential losses that would be incurred if that system is attacked or if there's some failure of that system. And in order to provide that security assurance, we need to generate a number of evidentiary artifacts to support any claim that we have about the security of the system. So if I want to convince you that a system that I've developed is secure, what do I need to show you in order to have you believe me that it is secure, right? So when we start looking at these different kinds of evidence, this goes and starts looking at what kinds of artifacts are generated as part of the development process of these kinds of systems. And this could be anything from design documentation about our system architectures, specifications and verification of requirements for our systems, the vulnerability analyses, the penetration tests, any other kinds of analyses as well. How we manage the configurations of the systems once we put them into operation, right? So what we see is that we need to generate these pieces of evidence at various phases of the development of the system, because without that, you're not going to have that convincing argument, okay? So to put this into context, when we think about how do we actually develop a secure and trustworthy system from a process perspective, we have all of these different processes that are in place, and we have our actual system development life cycle. And we're overlaying all of these processes together, and what we're trying to do is, at each of these phases, generate evidence in order to support that assurance claim. So one of the ways in which we can actually bring all of this together is through what we call an assurance case. And what an assurance case is basically the structured argument that you would have to convince someone that the system you developed is secure. So what assurance cases are particularly useful for is that they actually capture the rationale for how multiple analyses that you've conducted come together to relate to high-level claims about your system. So a high-level claim would be something that my system is adequately secure. And there'd be, in addition to that, a context which is going to support what adequately secure means for the specific system that I am trying to assure. And we have a number of different notations that can be used to actually present these kinds of arguments. So when we think about how standards play a role in this security assurance process, standards are designed to be those accepted means of structuring and documenting our best practice. So what that means is that they actually have an intention to provide clear and detailed processes and procedures that will help us to determine what actually needs to be shown in support of your assurance claims and what's the specific evidence that would need to be provided as part of an evaluation of that argument. Not all standards actually provide this in as a clear and detailed way as we would hope. And partly this is because there is this overarching challenge. And the challenge is that there's still a lack of widely accepted standardized approaches for evaluating and measuring security. And on top of this, evaluating and measuring security at the different stages of the system development lifecycle. So what I propose that we can do in order to address this challenge is to start thinking about how do we holistically think about the assurance activity in support of the development of standards that would define how to conduct these activities, in the context of the development lifecycle. So when we start thinking about how you would securely develop a system, you would get some sort of V model like this. And I'm going to draw your attention to the red text on the slide, which basically shows the different kinds of assurance that you need to provide in order to have that holistic claim about your system. So if we can start injecting different approaches and standardizing the way in which we gather the evidence at all of these phases of the system development, then we can have much more compelling security assurance arguments that will ensure that our users of our systems will have that desired level of trust. So as a concrete example of this, we can document our security assurance cases using, in this case, I use goal structuring notation. It's simply a notation of presenting our argument. So the blue rectangles represent the goals and sub-goals of our system. The yellow here, it provides some context to what we're actually talking about. The green parallelogram here represents a strategy for why you are able to justify and support that high-level claim, given all of the sub-claims being satisfied. And basically, this builds a top-down approach of how you would argue that a system, in this case, it's for advanced metering infrastructure, is secure and resilient. And at some point, you're going to have, in these ovals here, the evidence that's being submitted in support of your claims. And you can reconstruct your argument from the bottom up to say, if I have all of this evidence, I can satisfy these claims, and if I satisfy these claims, then I can satisfy the higher level ones. So what this notation actually shows us is specifically what are those pieces of evidence that we need to provide if we're going to convince someone that our advanced metering infrastructure in this case is in fact secure and resilient. So how that works is in the process of developing that security assurance case, I start thinking about the kinds of evidence that I need to show or generate as part of my development process in order to support the assurance claims that I'm trying to make about my system. What that gives me is that what do I need to propose and what kind of evidence do I need in order to support those claims. If I use that information when developing my cybersecurity standards, I can start basically documenting best practice in terms of what kind of evidence and how should it be presented in order to support the development of assurance arguments again. So sort of coming around the cycle here. If I incorporate this into my cybersecurity standards, then what I use is those standards as the security requirements that need to be shown in my security assurance case, and we basically come back around again. So it becomes this iterative process now. Now, I know some of you are wondering and saying, well, this isn't how standards are ever going to be developed. You're not going to be iteratively developing them like this. And that's not really what I'm proposing here. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that in performing these activities as a practitioner, you gain a lot of insight into how you can better support the assurance arguments that you have. And if you can document that appropriately, that can inform others who need to do the same kinds of things later, which effectively is what our standardized processes point to. So in order to wrap up here, I'm going to just put all of this up first. And basically, I'm proposing a call to action, because there's a lot that can be done in this space. So one of the biggest things is that we can leverage the development of assurance cases and adapt them to security. Assurance cases have a long history of being used as a valuable tool when arguing about system safety, but we haven't had that same sort of adoption when it comes to security. One of the things that's very important in this assurance case development process is to actually include our system stakeholders as part of that process. They can help to determine whether or not the arguments that you're making are actually complete and whether they make any sort of sense whatsoever at the end of the day. And when we start bringing all of this back together, it's how can we use this information to develop those more well-documented and accepted standards, guidelines, and/or requirements. And what I'm really pitching is that the assurance case development activity can play a significant role in understanding how to develop these kinds of cybersecurity standards. And then just a couple more here is we need better approaches to actually evaluate both systems for generating the evidence of that support security assurance cases, but also evaluation approaches for security assurance cases themselves. How do you know that the argument that you're presenting makes any sort of logical sense, right? So there aren't really good tools to help do this. And then finally, we've seen this a couple of times, is how do you gather that evidence and have that evidentiary basis to support the security claims that you want to make about your system? And that's all about how do you accumulate all of the results of the different analyses throughout your system development lifecycle in order to support those claims. And where would that all come from? That would all come from, again, those standards documents that give you that guidance in what to propose. So just to conclude here, what I'm pitching is that without the presence of these well-documented and accepted standards, the development of a secure and trustworthy system is going to remain challenging. These two ideas feed into each other, and they need to be developed in harmony with one another. And I think what's been happening in the past is that they've been done in isolation from one another, and they end up being somewhat incompatible. So if we put some further effort into developing more rigorous standards that are outcome-oriented, right? We want to be able to use what standards provide in order to support our security assurance claims. And we want all of that evidence to be generated based on those sound technological principles, right? We want to make sure that that evidence actually holds some weight. Okay, so just I pulled from a lot of different references to talk about this topic today, and I guess we're holding questions till the end, so I'm happy to answer them after we hear our final speaker. Thank you.